The morning alarm screamed at 0430 hours, but Sarah Chun had been awake for 20 minutes already. She lay motionless in her narrow bunk, listening to the sounds of Fort Bragg stirring to life outside the barracks windows. The other soldiers in her unit groaned and shuffled as they prepared for another grueling day of special operations training. But Sarah's mind was already focused on what lay ahead. At 25, Sarah had already proven herself in conventional infantry operations during 2 deployments to Afghanistan. Her service record was spotless, her physical fitness scores consistently maxed out, and her tactical knowledge impressed even veteran instructors. But none of that seemed to matter when she walked into the briefing room that morning and saw the skeptical faces of her male counterparts. "Listen up, people," barked Sergeant Major Williams, a grizzled veteran whose scarred hands told stories of decades in special operations. "Today we're starting the selection process for Black Ops integration. This isn't your regular Army training. This is the real deal. The missions you'll be preparing for don't exist on paper. The operations you'll conduct never happened. And the enemies you'll face won't follow any rules of engagement you've ever studied." Sarah straightened in her chair, absorbing every word. She had volunteered for this program against the advice of her commanding officer, who had suggested she might be better suited for intelligence analysis or logistics coordination. The suggestion had stung, but it had also fueled her determination to prove that gender had nothing to do with operational capability. The sergeant major continued his briefing, outlining the next 6 weeks of intensive training that would determine who among the 32 candidates would earn a spot in the classified program. You'll be tested on everything from close-quarters combat to psychological resilience under torture simulation. You'll learn infiltration techniques that require you to become someone else entirely. And you'll master weapons systems that officially don't exist. As he spoke, Sarah noticed several of the male candidates glancing in her direction with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright dismissal. She had grown accustomed to being the only woman in many military settings, but something about this environment felt different. The stakes were higher, the scrutiny more intense, and the margin for error non-existent. After the briefing, the candidates were divided into 6 teams of 5 members each. Sarah found herself assigned to Team Charlie along with 4 men who introduced themselves with the casual confidence of soldiers who had never doubted their place in the military hierarchy. There was Marcus, a former Marine sniper from Detroit who spoke in measured sentences and seemed to calculate every word before speaking. Jake, a demolitions expert from Texas whose easy smile masked a sharp tactical mind. Rodriguez, a communications specialist whose slight frame belied his reputation for enduring extreme physical challenges. And finally, Thompson, a former Green Beret whose skeptical expression when he looked at Sarah made his opinion perfectly clear. "Well," Thompson said as they gathered their gear for the first exercise, "looks like we got ourselves a diversity hire." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Sarah had heard variations of it throughout her military career, but never quite so bluntly stated. She could feel the other team members watching to see how she would respond. This was a test within the test, she realized. How she handled this moment would set the tone for everything that followed. "Good thing the enemy won't care about diversity when they're trying to kill us," she replied evenly, shouldering her pack and checking her equipment. "They'll just want us dead. Question is whether you can keep up when it matters." Thompson's expression shifted slightly, a hint of surprise replacing the dismissiveness. Marcus nodded approvingly, while Jake let out a low whistle. Rodriguez simply smiled and shook his head. The first exercise was a navigation challenge through the dense forest surrounding Fort Bragg. Each team was given coordinates for 5 checkpoints scattered across 25 miles of difficult terrain. They had 12 hours to reach all 5 points and return to base, carrying full combat loads and operating under the assumption that hostile forces were tracking their movement. What made the exercise particularly challenging was the requirement to maintain complete radio silence, except for predetermined check-in times. The teams had to rely entirely on their internal communication and collective decision-making skills. Any team that failed to reach all checkpoints within the time limit would be eliminated from the selection process. As Team Charlie moved through the forest, Sarah quickly established herself as the most efficient navigator. Her years of experience in Afghanistan's challenging terrain had taught her to read landscape features that others might miss. She could identify north by the moss growth patterns on trees, estimate distance by analyzing the density of vegetation, and calculate travel time by assessing the gradient of slopes ahead. "How do you know we're going the right way?" Thompson asked after they had been moving for 3 hours without consulting a map or GPS device. Sarah pointed to a distinctive rock formation visible through a gap in the trees. That outcropping appeared on the topographical map about 2 kilometers northeast of Checkpoint 3. The stream we crossed 15 minutes ago was running southeast, which means we're in the right valley. And the sun angle confirms we've been maintaining the correct bearing. Thompson studied her for a moment, then nodded. It was the first sign of respect she had seen from him. The second checkpoint proved more challenging than expected. According to their briefing, it should have been located near an abandoned logging road. But when they reached the coordinates, they found only dense forest with no sign of human activity. Sarah examined the GPS readings while the others spread out to search the immediate area. "Something's not right," she said after double-checking their position. "Either the coordinates are wrong, or this is part of the test." "What do you mean?" asked Rodriguez. "Think about it. In a real black ops situation, intelligence is often incomplete or deliberately misleading. Maybe they're testing whether we can adapt when the mission parameters change." Jake found their answer 20 minutes later when he discovered a small metal box hidden beneath a fallen log 50 meters from the official coordinates. Inside was a new set of instructions that confirmed Sarah's suspicion. The teams were expected to recognize and adapt to changing conditions without explicit guidance. As they continued through the forest, Sarah began to notice something interesting about her teammates' behavior. Initially, they had operated as 4 individual soldiers who happened to be moving in the same direction. But gradually, they started functioning as an integrated unit. Marcus began sharing his observations about potential sniper positions without being asked. Jake started pointing out terrain features that could conceal improvised explosive devices. Rodriguez monitored radio frequencies for any sign of opposing forces, even though the exercise was supposedly conducted in a sterile environment. And Thompson, despite his initial skepticism, began deferring to Sarah's navigation expertise without question. When they reached the 4th checkpoint ahead of schedule, he was the first to acknowledge her contribution. "I was wrong about you," he said as they took a brief rest before pushing toward the final objective. "You know your stuff." "I haven't proven anything yet," Sarah replied. "We still have to finish this thing." The 5th checkpoint turned out to be the most challenging of all. It was located on top of a steep ridge that required a grueling 3-hour climb through increasingly difficult terrain. As they ascended, the temperature dropped and fog began rolling in from the west. Visibility decreased to less than 50 meters, making navigation exponentially more difficult. Sarah found herself relying on techniques she had learned from mountain warfare training in Colorado. She used the sound of wind through different types of vegetation to estimate elevation changes, and the feel of air pressure changes to predict weather shifts. When Rodriguez stumbled and twisted his ankle during the climb, she helped him redistribute his equipment weight to maintain mobility. "You're doing good, Chun," Marcus said quietly as they approached what they hoped was the final checkpoint. "Natural leader. We're all leaders out here," she replied. "That's the point." They reached the 5th checkpoint with 2 hours to spare, but the celebration was brief. The return journey to base would test their endurance and unit cohesion in ways the outbound trip had not. They were tired, hungry, and operating on limited sleep from the previous night's preparation. The fog was getting thicker, making it easy to become disoriented and separated from the group. During the descent from the ridge, Thompson slipped on loose rocks and started sliding toward a steep drop-off. Without thinking, Sarah lunged forward and grabbed his equipment harness, using her body weight to arrest his fall. The maneuver left them both bruised and shaken, but Thompson was unharmed. "Thanks," he said simply, but Sarah could see in his eyes that something fundamental had changed between them. They reached the base camp with 37 minutes to spare, making them the second team to complete the exercise successfully. As they checked in with the instructors, Sarah noticed that several other teams had already been eliminated. The diversity of challenges built into the navigation exercise had exposed weaknesses in teamwork, leadership, and adaptability that might not have become apparent in more traditional training scenarios. That evening, as the remaining candidates gathered for a debrief session, Sergeant Major Williams addressed the group with his typical bluntness. "Today's exercise eliminated 8 of you. That leaves 24 candidates for tomorrow's challenges. But before we dismiss, I want to make something clear." He paused and looked directly at Sarah. "Some of you came into this program with preconceived notions about who belongs in special operations. Today's results should have corrected those misconceptions. The enemy doesn't care about your assumptions. They only care about your capabilities. I suggest you adjust your thinking accordingly." As the candidates dispersed to prepare for the next day's training, Thompson approached Sarah near the barracks entrance. "Look," he said, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say, "I owe you an apology. That diversity hire comment was out of line." "Yes, it was," Sarah agreed. "But you're not the first person to doubt whether I belong here, and you won't be the last. The difference is whether you let your assumptions override the evidence." "Fair enough. For what it's worth, you saved my life out there today. I won't forget that." Sarah nodded and headed inside to clean her equipment and prepare for whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. She had passed the first test, but she knew that earning respect from her immediate teammates was only the beginning. The real challenges lay ahead, and she would need to prove herself again and again before anyone would truly accept that she belonged in the world of black operations. As she lay in her bunk that night, listening to the sounds of other candidates preparing for sleep, Sarah reflected on what she had learned during the day's exercise. The navigation challenge had been about much more than finding checkpoints in the forest. It had been about adapting to unexpected conditions, maintaining unit cohesion under stress, and demonstrating leadership when circumstances demanded it. She had proven to herself and her teammates that she could meet those challenges, but she also understood that tomorrow would bring new tests designed to push her even further beyond her perceived limitations. The instructors were systematically breaking down every candidate's assumptions about their own capabilities and forcing them to rebuild their confidence on more solid foundations. The thought was both intimidating and exhilarating. Sarah had spent her entire military career fighting to prove that she deserved the same opportunities as her male counterparts. Now she was finally getting the chance to compete on completely equal terms, where performance was the only criteria that mattered. She closed her eyes and began mentally preparing for the challenges ahead. Somewhere in the darkness outside, other teams were still struggling through the forest, fighting to complete the navigation exercise before time expired. Some would succeed, and others would be eliminated from the program before sunrise. But Sarah had survived the first cut, and she intended to survive whatever came next. The morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and new chances to demonstrate that excellence had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with determination, skill, and the willingness to push beyond what others believed possible. She had warned Thompson that the enemy wouldn't care about diversity when they were trying to kill everyone equally. Tomorrow, she would start learning exactly what that meant in practice. The second week of selection brought challenges that pushed every candidate beyond their previous understanding of what special operations demanded. Sarah woke each morning knowing that the day's training would test not just her physical capabilities, but her psychological resilience and tactical intelligence in ways that conventional military training had never approached. The closed-quarters battle facility at Fort Bragg looked like an ordinary warehouse from the outside, but inside it contained a complex maze of rooms, corridors, and simulated urban environments that could be reconfigured for different training scenarios. Sarah and the remaining 24 candidates gathered outside the facility at 0500 hours, where they met their new instructor for the first time. Master Sergeant Patricia Ghost Morrison had earned her nickname during 3 tours in Iraq, where she had conducted successful infiltration missions behind enemy lines that officially never happened. She was compact and efficient in her movements, with eyes that seemed to register every detail of her surroundings simultaneously. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had proven herself in situations where mistakes meant death. Today you learn that everything you think you know about combat is wrong, she began, her gaze moving systematically across the group of candidates. In conventional warfare, you fight enemies who follow predictable patterns and operate according to established rules. In black operations, your enemies are professionals who have been trained to kill people exactly like you. They know your tactics, they understand your equipment, and they are prepared for your most likely responses to any given situation. She gestured toward the warehouse behind her. Inside this facility, you will face scenarios that simulate real-world black ops missions. The opposition force consists of instructors who have actual experience in these types of operations. They will not give you any advantages based on your rank, your gender, or your previous accomplishments. They will attempt to eliminate you using whatever methods are most efficient. Sarah felt a familiar tension building in her shoulders. She had excelled in conventional combat training, but she knew that close-quarters battle required a completely different skill set. Success depended on split-second decision-making, precise weapon handling, and the ability to maintain tactical awareness while moving through complex environments under extreme stress. The candidates were divided into 4 teams of 6 members each. Sarah found herself assigned to a new team that included 2 candidates she had not worked with previously. There was Kelly, a former Navy SEAL whose quiet confidence reminded her of Marcus, and Patel, an intelligence analyst whose slight build concealed impressive fighting skills that had surprised everyone during the previous week's physical challenges. Their first exercise was a hostage rescue scenario. The team was given a floor plan of a 3-story building where terrorists had taken hostages in an unknown location. Their mission was to infiltrate the building, locate and secure the hostages, and eliminate all hostile forces without causing civilian casualties. Remember, Master Sergeant Morrison warned as the teams prepare to enter the facility. In real Black Ops missions, there is no such thing as acceptable losses. Mission failure is not an option, and neither is collateral damage. You succeed completely, or you don't succeed at all. Sarah's team approached the building from the east side, using hand signals to coordinate their movement. Kelly took point, with Sarah covering the right flank while Patel watched for threats from elevated positions. The other 3 team members maintained overwatch and prepared to respond to contact from any direction. The first floor appeared empty, but Sarah's instincts told her they were being watched. She had learned to trust those instincts during her deployments in Afghanistan, where the difference between paranoia and preparation often determined who survived and who didn't. She signaled for the team to halt and spent 30 seconds listening for any sound that didn't belong in an abandoned building. The attack came from above. Simulated gunfire erupted from second-story windows as the opposition force attempted to pin down Sarah's team in the exposed first-floor corridor. But instead of taking cover and returning fire as conventional tactics would dictate, Kelly led the team in an immediate assault toward the stairs leading to the second floor. "Move fast, stay low, don't give them time to adjust," Kelly whispered as they bounded up the stairs. Sarah understood the logic immediately. In close-quarters combat, hesitation was often more dangerous than aggressive action. The second-floor layout was more complex than the first, with multiple rooms connected by narrow corridors that limited visibility and created numerous potential ambush points. Sarah's team had to clear each room systematically while maintaining awareness of threats that could emerge from areas they had already secured. Sarah kicked in the door to what appeared to be an office space and found herself facing two opposition force members who were using desks and filing cabinets as cover. The range was less than 10 meters, close enough that marksmanship precision mattered less than speed and tactical positioning. She rolled left while firing 3 quick shots at the first target, then immediately shifted to engage the second opponent who was attempting to flank her from the right side of the room. The simulation round struck both targets center mass, but Sarah knew that in a real-world situation, the margin for error would have been much smaller. "Clear," she called out, but kept her weapon trained on the doorway while Kelly and Patel moved through to check for additional threats. They found the hostages on the 3rd floor, but reaching them required negotiating a corridor that was covered by opposition force members positioned at both ends. The tactical challenge was complicated by the fact that any use of explosives or suppressive fire could endanger the civilians they were trying to rescue. Patel suggested a solution that demonstrated why intelligence analysts were included in special operations teams. He had noticed during their approach that the building's electrical system was controlled from a utility room on the 2nd floor. If they could cut power to the 3rd floor, they could use night vision equipment to gain a tactical advantage over the opposition force. The plan worked perfectly. Sarah's team eliminated the remaining hostile forces and secured the hostages in less than 4 minutes from initial contact. But as they prepared to exfiltrate the building, Master Sergeant Morrison's voice crackled through their communication system with an unexpected development. New intelligence indicates additional hostile forces are moving to surround the building. You have 3 minutes to reach the extraction point before the area becomes untenable. Sarah realized that the exercise was designed to test not just their ability to complete the primary mission, but their capacity to adapt when mission parameters changed without warning. In real black operations, intelligence was often incomplete or outdated, and success depended on the team's ability to make effective decisions with limited information. They reached the extraction point with 17 seconds to spare, but Sarah knew that the time margin was irrelevant compared to the lesson she had learned during the exercise. Close quarters battle required a completely different mindset than conventional combat. Success depended less on overwhelming firepower and more on precision, timing, and the ability to outthink opponents who were just as well-trained and motivated as she was. Over the following days, the close quarters training scenarios became progressively more challenging. Sarah's team faced situations involving chemical weapons, explosive devices, and opposition forces that used civilian shields to complicate their tactical decisions. Each exercise pushed them to develop new skills and abandon assumptions about what constituted effective combat techniques. During one particularly challenging scenario, Sarah found herself separated from her team and trapped in a building with multiple opposition force members actively hunting for her. She had limited ammunition, no communication with her teammates, and no clear route to the extraction point. The situation required her to use stealth and misdirection rather than direct confrontation. She spent 43 minutes moving through the building's ventilation system, using her knowledge of the facility's layout to avoid detection while gathering intelligence about enemy positions. When she finally emerged to rejoin her team, she had not fired a single shot but had provided crucial information that allowed them to complete the mission successfully. "That was some impressive work, Chun," Master Sergeant Morrison said during the post-exercise debrief. "You've demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that separates Black Ops personnel from conventional forces. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to avoid fighting until you can control the terms of engagement." But the most significant challenge of the second week came during an exercise that tested the candidates' psychological resilience under extreme stress. Sarah's team was captured during a simulated mission and subjected to interrogation techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was legally permissible during training. The opposition force used a combination of physical discomfort, psychological pressure, and misinformation to break down the candidates' resistance to interrogation. Sarah was isolated in a small, windowless room where the temperature alternated between uncomfortably hot and cold. She was deprived of sleep, given limited food and water, and subjected to constant noise designed to prevent rest and relaxation. The interrogators used personal information from her military records to create psychological pressure. They claimed that her teammates had already revealed classified information and that her continued resistance was pointless. They suggested that her presence in the Special Operations Program was a political decision rather than a merit-based selection, attempting to undermine her confidence in her own capabilities. "Your team leader has already told us everything we need to know about your mission," one interrogator insisted during a session that occurred after Sarah had been awake for 36 hours. "He said you were the weak link, that you couldn't be trusted with critical information. Why don't you make this easier on yourself and just answer our questions?" Sarah knew that the interrogation was a training exercise, but the psychological pressure felt completely real. The interrogators were skilled professionals who understood how to exploit doubt, fear, and exhaustion to break down resistance. She had to draw on every lesson from her previous military training while developing new mental defenses against techniques she had never encountered before. She survived the interrogation by focusing on technical aspects of her military training rather than personal motivations that could be exploited by the opposition. When asked about mission details, she provided only information that would be known by any soldier with her rank and experience level. When pressed for more specific intelligence, she repeated basic personal information like name, rank, and service number. The exercise lasted 72 hours, but Sarah maintained her resistance throughout the entire period. When it was finally over, she discovered that only 8 of the original 24 candidates had successfully completed the interrogation training without revealing classified information. Psychological resilience is not about being tough, Master Sergeant Morrison explained during the final debrief session. It's about understanding your own mental processes well enough to maintain control when everything else is designed to make you lose control. The candidates who failed this exercise were not weak or cowardly. They simply had not yet developed the specific mental skills that black operations require. Sarah understood that the interrogation training had been about more than just resisting enemy questioning techniques. It had been designed to identify candidates who could maintain their professional judgment and tactical thinking even when subjected to extreme psychological pressure. In real black operations, personnel often worked alone or in small teams where individual psychological resilience could determine the success or failure of critical missions. As the second week concluded, Sarah realized that she was beginning to understand what made black operations different from conventional military activities. It was not just about advanced weapons or secret missions. It was about developing mental and physical capabilities that allowed personnel to succeed in situations where normal military training was insufficient. The remaining 8 candidates had proven themselves capable of meeting challenges that most soldiers would never encounter. But Sarah also understood that they were only halfway through the selection process. The next phase would test their ability to integrate all their new skills into operational scenarios that simulated real-world black operations missions. She spent the weekend before the third week reviewing everything she had learned about close-quarters combat, psychological resilience, and team dynamics under extreme stress. She had survived challenges that had eliminated 2/3 of the original candidates, but she knew that the most difficult tests still lay ahead. The instructors had been systematically breaking down the candidates' assumptions about their own limitations and forcing them to develop new capabilities under conditions that most people would consider impossible. Sarah had proven to herself that she could meet those challenges, but she also understood that success in the selection process was only the beginning of her journey into the world of black operations. As she prepared for the third week of training, Sarah reflected on how much her understanding of combat and military service had changed since the program began. She had entered the selection process as an accomplished infantry soldier with extensive combat experience. But she was emerging as something entirely different, a professional who could operate effectively in situations where conventional military training was not just insufficient, but potentially counterproductive. The transformation was not yet complete, but Sarah could sense that she was approaching the point where she would either succeed completely or fail in ways that would end her military career. There was no middle ground in black operations, no partial credit for good intentions or exceptional effort. Success required meeting absolute standards under conditions where anything less than perfect execution could result in mission failure and loss of life. She was ready to find out whether she could meet those standards when everything was on the line. The final week of selection arrived with a deceptive calm that Sarah had learned to distrust. The 8 remaining candidates assembled in a briefing room that contained none of the usual training materials or equipment displays. Instead, they faced a simple table with 8 sealed envelopes and a projection screen that displayed only a classified information warning. Colonel James Harrison entered the room precisely at 0600 hours. Sarah had heard stories about Harrison during her time at Fort Bragg, but this was her first time seeing the legendary Black Operations Commander in person. He moved with the economic grace of someone who had spent decades operating in environments where wasted motion could mean death. His eyes held the particular alertness of a professional who understood that threats could emerge from any direction at any moment. "Congratulations," he began without preamble. "You have survived a selection process that eliminates 97% of volunteers. You have demonstrated capabilities that place you in the top 1% of military professionals worldwide. But you have not yet proven that you can succeed in actual Black operations missions." He gestured toward the sealed envelopes on the table. Each envelope contains a mission assignment that will test everything you have learned during the past 5 weeks. These are not training exercises. They are real-world operations that have been waiting for personnel with your specific skill sets. The difference is that failure will have consequences that extend far beyond your individual careers. Sarah felt her pulse accelerate as the implications became clear. The selection process was concluding with actual missions rather than simulations. Whatever was in those envelopes represented genuine national security operations that required the precise capabilities they had been developing throughout their training. "You will work alone," Colonel Harrison continued. "No backup teams, no communication support after insertion, no extraction assistance unless you specifically request it by completing your assigned objectives. Success means you join the Black operations community as a fully qualified operator. Failure means you return to your previous units with no record of this program ever existing." He paused and looked directly at each candidate in turn. When his gaze reached Sarah, she saw neither encouragement nor doubt, only professional assessment. Questions? No one spoke. Sarah understood that they had moved beyond the point where questions would be answered. From this moment forward, they would operate with the same limited information that characterized real Black operations missions. "Select your envelopes in alphabetical order by surname," Colonel Harrison ordered. "You have 1 hour to review your mission parameters and prepare your equipment. Transportation to insertion points begins at 0800 hours." Sarah watched as each candidate selected their envelope and moved to separate preparation areas. When her turn came, she chose the 5th envelope from the left, though she suspected the selection process was irrelevant since all missions had probably been specifically designed for individual candidates based on their demonstrated strengths and weaknesses. Her envelope contained a single sheet of paper with details that made her understand why Colonel Harrison had warned them about real-world consequences. The mission was straightforward in concept, but extraordinarily demanding in execution. Intelligence sources had identified a terrorist cell operating from a compound in a politically sensitive location where conventional military action was not permissible. The cell was planning an attack on civilian targets that would cause mass casualties and potentially destabilize an entire region. Sarah's mission was to infiltrate the compound, gather definitive evidence of the planned attack, and eliminate the cell's leadership without creating any indication of American involvement. The insertion point was 2 kilometers from the target compound, in terrain that offered minimal cover and concealment. She would have to approach during daylight hours because the compound was secured by night vision equipment that would detect any nocturnal infiltration attempt. Her extraction window was 16 hours after insertion, a location 3 kilometers from the compound in a direction that required her to evade multiple security checkpoints. Most challenging of all, the mission required her to operate in a cultural context where her gender could either be an advantage or a fatal disadvantage, depending on how she managed her cover identity. The region's social customs would allow her access to certain areas that would be impossible for male operators to penetrate, but they would also create vulnerabilities that could expose her mission if she made any cultural mistakes. Sarah spent her preparation hour reviewing satellite imagery of the target area, memorizing the faces of her primary targets, and selecting equipment that would support her cover identity while providing the capabilities necessary to complete her mission. She chose clothing that would allow her to blend with local civilian populations, weapons that could be concealed effectively, and communication equipment that would enable her to transmit critical intelligence, even if she could not complete the full mission. The transportation to her insertion point was a commercial flight to a regional airport, followed by a bus journey to a small town where she would complete her infiltration on foot. During the flight, Sarah reviewed every detail of her mission parameters while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary traveler. The transition from military training environment to actual operational deployment felt both gradual and sudden. She spent the bus journey observing local customs and adjusting her behavior to match regional social norms. By the time she reached her insertion point, she had transformed from an American soldier into a convincing local civilian whose presence would not attract unwanted attention from security forces or civilian observers. The approach to the target compound required 6 hours of careful movement through terrain that offered excellent observation points for hostile forces. Sarah used techniques she had learned during the navigation exercise, but applied them to avoid human rather than geographical obstacles. She moved during periods when local activity patterns would mask her presence, used natural features to break up her profile, and maintained constant awareness of sight lines that could expose her to observation. The compound itself was more heavily defended than the satellite imagery had indicated. Sarah counted 12 security personnel rather than the 8 described in her briefing, and she observed defensive measures that suggested the terrorist cell had received advanced training in operational security. The challenge was not just infiltrating the compound, but doing so in a way that would allow her to gather the required intelligence and eliminate her targets without alerting the additional security forces. Sarah spent 4 hours in Overwatch position, studying the compound's activity patterns and identifying the daily routines that would provide her best infiltration opportunities. She observed that the security personnel rotated shifts every 6 hours, and that there was a 15-minute gap during each rotation when certain areas of the compound were not under direct observation. More importantly, she identified a weakness in the compound's security that she could exploit using the cultural advantages her gender provided. The compound included a separate area for women and children that was guarded less intensively because local customs prohibited male security personnel from entering those spaces without specific authorization. Sarah's infiltration began during the afternoon shift change. She approached the compound from the south side, where a drainage ditch provided concealment, until she was within 50 meters of the perimeter fence. During the brief gap in security coverage, she cut through the fence and moved to the women's area of the compound. Her cover story was that she was seeking shelter after fleeing from domestic violence in a neighboring village. The story was culturally plausible and would explain her presence without creating suspicion among the compound's residents. More importantly, it would give her access to areas where the terrorist cell's leadership might be vulnerable to observation and elimination. The women who managed the compound's domestic arrangements accepted her story without question and provided her with clothing and temporary shelter. Sarah used her time in the women's area to gather intelligence about the compound's layout, the location of her primary targets, and the timing of activities that would provide opportunities to complete her mission. She learned that the terrorist cell's leadership met each evening in a secure room to plan the next day's activities. The meetings occurred during evening prayers when most of the compound's residents were occupied with religious observances. Security during these meetings was reduced because the leadership assumed they were protected by the compound's perimeter defenses and the presence of their armed personnel throughout the facility. Sarah's opportunity came on her second evening in the compound. During evening prayers, she moved from the women's area to the leadership meeting location using service corridors that were not covered by the compound security cameras. Her approach required precise timing and complete silence, since discovery would mean immediate execution and mission failure. The secure room contained 3 of her 4 primary targets. Sarah observed through a ventilation grate as they discussed final preparations for their planned attack on civilian targets. She used a miniaturized recording device to capture their conversation, gathering definitive evidence of their intentions and timeline for the attack. When the meeting concluded and the participants began to separate, Sarah faced the most challenging aspect of her mission. She had to eliminate all 3 targets without creating any indication that they had been killed by an outside operative. Their deaths had to appear accidental or the result of internal conflict within the terrorist organization. Sarah used techniques she had learned during the close quarters combat training, but applied them to eliminate targets silently rather than through direct confrontation. She tampered with the vehicle that 2 of the targets were using to travel to another location, creating mechanical failures that would cause a fatal accident several kilometers from the compound. The modifications were subtle enough that investigation would reveal only equipment malfunction rather than sabotage. The 3rd target required a different approach. Sarah waited until he returned to his private quarters, then used a contact poison that would cause cardiac arrest several hours later. The substance was undetectable by conventional medical examination and would appear to be a natural death from heart disease. Her 4th target was not present in the compound, but Sarah's intelligence gathering had revealed his location and movement patterns. She tracked him to a safe house in the nearest town, where she eliminated him using a method that appeared to be the result of a robbery attempt gone wrong. Sarah's extraction from the compound required the same careful planning that had characterized her infiltration. She waited until the early morning hours when security personnel were least alert and compound residents were sleeping. She left the women's area during a shift change, moved through the service corridors to reach the perimeter fence, and exited through the same breach she had created during her initial infiltration. The journey to her extraction point took 8 hours through terrain that had become more dangerous because of increased security activity following her target's deaths. Although the deaths appeared unrelated to external operation, the terrorist cell's remaining members had increased their security measures as a precautionary response. Sarah reached her extraction point with 3 hours to spare, but she used the additional time to ensure that she had not been followed and that her escape route was clear of hostile forces. When her extraction team arrived precisely on schedule, she provided them with the intelligence she had gathered and confirmation that all primary targets had been eliminated successfully. The return journey to Fort Bragg gave Sarah time to process what she had accomplished during the previous 72 hours. She had completed a mission that combined every skill she had developed during the selection process: navigation under difficult conditions, close quarters combat techniques, psychological resilience under extreme stress, cultural adaptation, and the ability to make critical decisions with limited information and no support from conventional military resources. More importantly, she had proven to herself that she could succeed in the world of black operations not by overcoming the disadvantages of being a woman, but by leveraging the unique advantages that her gender provided in specific operational contexts. The mission had required capabilities that no male operator could have developed, regardless of their training or experience. When she returned to Fort Bragg, Sarah found Colonel Harrison waiting in the same briefing room where the final week had begun. This time, however, the room contained only 2 chairs rather than 8. The other candidates had not yet returned from their missions, and Sarah realized that she might be the first to complete her assignment successfully. "Mission report," Colonel Harrison said simply. Sarah provided a comprehensive summary of her infiltration, intelligence gathering, target elimination, and extraction. She included details about the compound security measures, the terrorist cell's attack plans, and the method she had used to complete her objectives without compromising operational security. When she finished, Colonel Harrison studied her for a long moment. You encountered multiple situations that were not covered in your original mission briefing. How did you handle the unexpected challenges? I applied the principles I learned during selection training, Sarah replied. I adapted to changing conditions, used all available resources to accomplish the mission objectives, and maintained operational security throughout the entire deployment. The other candidates warned you that black operations were not suitable for women, Colonel Harrison observed. How do you respond to that assessment now? Sarah considered her answer carefully. They were right that black operations place demands on personnel that conventional military training does not prepare you for. But they were wrong to assume that gender determines who can meet those demands. This mission required capabilities that had nothing to do with physical strength or traditional combat skills. Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. There will always be people who doubt whether you belong in this community. Some of them will be people you work with, people whose lives may depend on your performance during critical operations. How will you handle that ongoing challenge? The same way I handled the selection process, Sarah said. By proving my capabilities through performance rather than trying to convince anyone through arguments. Results speak louder than opinions. Welcome to Black Operations, Operative Chun, Colonel Harrison said, extending his hand. Your first official mission briefing is tomorrow at 0600 hours. As Sarah left the briefing room, she realized that her journey was just beginning. She had proven that she could succeed in the world's most demanding military operations, but she had not yet discovered what kind of operator she would become or what missions awaited her in the years ahead. The selection process had transformed her from a conventional soldier into a black operations professional capable of succeeding in situations that most people could not imagine. But more importantly, it had taught her that excellence had nothing to do with conforming to other people's expectations, and everything to do with developing capabilities that could meet any challenge. She had warned Thompson during the first week that the enemy wouldn't care about diversity when they were trying to kill everyone equally. Now she understood that the same principle applied to her own success in black operations. Her gender was irrelevant compared to her ability to complete missions that protected national security and saved civilian lives. As she walked across the base toward her new assignment, Sarah reflected on the warning that had started her journey. That's Black Ops only, Thompson had said, implying that she wasn't qualified for such demanding work. She had proven him wrong, but more importantly, she had proven to herself that there were no limits to what she could accomplish when she refused to accept other people's assumptions about her limitations. The next morning would bring her first official mission as a qualified black operations operative. She was ready to discover what challenges awaited her in a world where success was measured by results rather than opinions, and where proving people wrong was just another part of getting the job done.